and today I'm going to be talking to you about survey development. So the first thing you need to do when creating a survey is have a firm grasp on what you're really researching. Expand your knowledge by doing extra background research on everything that you can find on the topic and explore related subjects. It's also helpful to get into contact with other researchers who are looking at a similar topic and ask them how their experience is going, any questions that you might have, or anything that they think you should look into. It's always good in a research project to have a constant inflow of new ideas. To keep tactics fresh and make sure you're actually asking the question that you want to. A good way to brainstorm could be with a group of people, just bouncing ideas off each other, or by bringing in an outside source and discussing your idea with them and having a conversation about your research field. Now, there's a few things you want to avoid when finalizing this research question. The first being letting the methods decide the question being asked. Sometimes the way you conduct your research can influence what your overall question is, but it's important to make sure you're not changing your question just based off the data collection available. Sometimes you have to dig deeper to solve the problem. Also, make sure you're not asking improbable questions like, how many dogs does it take to screw in a light bulb? You'll end up frustrated and without any answers. Finally, don't research other questions that have been found a good accepted answer. If a question has already been answered satisfactorily, you should instead explore a related question that is not. If you end up looking the same research question up, make sure to change a little thing about it. Like, if the study's done on high schoolers, maybe try changing it to people from 20 to 25 and see how they react to it. Just change a little details about your question to suit your interest and also what needs to be proven and what research needs to be done. So there are advantages and disadvantages to surveys. So some advantages are that the data is based off of real samples from people's perceptions of the world. So you're working with data directly from the source. The large coverage of people/events means that it's really likely that you will gain data based off of a representative example. And this can help data generalize a population. Doing research through surveys, you are able to amass large amounts of data in a relatively short time due to the number of people that will take a survey. It's also low cost with no expensive equipment fees. Just paper mail, maybe renting some space depending on the method employed. In addition to this, researchers are able to set up a finite time that allows responses to be accepted, which can help in planning. Now, disadvantages are that sometimes the significance of the data can be discarded due to researchers' need for full range of coverage. And data being gained will likely lack details or depth. It's also really hard to predict how many people will respond to your survey, especially when it's through something like mail or telephone. Also, your questions might be interpreted differently than what you intended. So this is why piloting, which is what we'll talk about later, is really important. There are many different methods to conduct a survey, the main ones being postal questionnaires, face-to-face, and telephone interviews, as well as online surveys. Each method has its own strengths and weaknesses. Postal questionnaires are sending the surveys to many people in a large geographical area. Postal questionnaires can be sent out in mass, but they have a low response rate, around 20%. A large sample size is needed to make sure the respondents reflect accurately the general opinion, and just so you can gain enough data. Then we have face-to-face interviews, which are often done by home calls or meeting someone on the street. Face-to-face is much more likely to gain a response because it gives you an opportunity to sell your research and make people care enough to respond. It can also help researchers balance demographic profiles by specifically selecting respondents, but it costs more money and time. Telephone interviews allow for an interaction and are easier and quicker, but they also garner a low response rate than other methods. but they do have a higher response rate than postal surveys, so just keep that in mind. Then we have online surveys, which are simple and cost-effective, but generally have a low response rate. Before picking the type of survey you want to do, it's important that you take the response rate into account and make sure you get enough responses for your research. Now we're on to design. So for planning, the topic of your survey should be planned and relate well to the research question so that you can yield helpful results. One thing that can prove helpful in this time is contacting experts or people involved in the field to make sure you cover all the necessary information and have the right questions. Before conducting your survey, you should always do a literature review on the material and look at similar questionnaires. Make sure that your survey will be overall simple, have an easy to interpret scoring system, and a reliable measurement of data, as well as an ability to adapt to change, and good planning and satisfactory development. Also, if there are any previous surveys already developed for what you're looking at, it's really great to adopt their scoring systems because it gives you very good resources and it gives you more credibility if it's a published research. Surveys should always have a clear layout. There are a few things to avoid when writing a survey in regards to layout, like the use of only capital letters, which is hard to read. Also, questions should be clearly grouped and organized by category, as well as headings for each subject, which add to the organization level. Now, there's a lot of things to keep in mind when you're asking questions, talking about the form. You first have double-barreled questions, which are questions that you have two questions inside. These should be avoided because people tend to only answer one or none of the questions provided. You need to make sure your questions are not confusing, so avoid questions that have double negatives, are ambiguous, or lead people on to respond a certain way. Also, oftentimes closed questions or questions that will only offer pre-coded answer are the best option for certain things, but you always need to make sure that you have enough responses or a good response range, because then your questions may be too closed, which would be bad for allowing people to express their opinions on a subject. Then we have open questions. You don't want your questions to be too open. And you also want to make sure as a researcher, you're kind of guiding them back to your point. Because when you ask an open question, people can really just talk about whatever they want to. And you're gaining a broader range of responses, but it takes a lot of time to analyze and it's kind of hard to kind of group responses. So just make sure you're keeping that in mind while asking questions. Also, make sure to bold your questions because it helps them stand out and be easily located. So piloting and development. Any survey should be tested on a group of people from the target audience before being implemented to the masses. This helps you as a researcher determine whether your survey is effective, comprehensible, and if you accidentally made any mistakes while writing the questions. For closed questions, this is also used to make sure you have the correct or sufficient allotted responses for a category, and see if any of the questions are often missed by those who respond. Also, everything should be the same with the method that you employ for your actual survey to ensure the validity of results and make sure that your survey takers for feedback give you good feedback and you can continue to develop and modify your survey from that. Also, make sure that the people you're surveying in your pilot are excluded from your real study as they can skew the results as they already know everything about the survey. Sometimes, if a sample size is extremely small, researchers will skip the piloting process just to make sure they have enough results to actually analyze their study. There are quite a few different ways to gain feedback when you're doing piloting. Some researchers contact the survey a few days later and give them a sheet that they can write any questions on, and others sit down with the surveyee and have them narrate their thoughts in real time as they're taking the survey. You can really do whatever you want to. It just depends on what you're comfortable with and what you think will help you the best. Then we have sampling. You can't collect data from every single person, so a good sample of the target audience must be taken. The method for sample of the population is needed to ensure a valid result. Questions to ask are, how will the sample size be selected? Or what's the optimal sample size to minimize sampling error? How can response rates be maximized? There are two main categories of sampling, and they can influence data. They're random and non-random sampling. Random is generally used for quantitative methods of gaining research data. It is the ideal version, but it can't always be achieved. It's used for quantitative a lot and would be used for qualitative, but unfortunately, there's usually a too small of a sample size, so sampling methods don't really allow for random sampling. Non-random sampling is usually used for qualitative data instead. It specifically targets individuals of an interest population, and there are a couple main techniques: propositive sampling, convenience sampling, and snowballing. There are strengths and weaknesses to both separate ways to sample data, and you need to make sure that the sample data is taken as a representative of the main population, as well as being aware of sample error. Sample error shows the probability that a sample does not actually represent the entire population. Sample error can never be removed totally, but simple random sampling gives the closest representation of the actual population, so the smallest sample error. Lastly, we have to talk about the ethical collection of data. So when you're doing a survey, you need to make sure you include a cover sheet. On your cover sheet, you need how, where, how many times, and by whom potential respondents were contacted. Also, how many people were approached and how many of those agreed to participate. How did those who agreed to participate differ than those who refused in regard to characteristics of interest to the study? For example, how were they identified? How were they approached? What was their gender, age, features of their likeness or healthcare? Also, how was the survey administered? Just like by telephone or interview. What was the response rate? And how much of this data is usable in your set? So that it's important to provide this cover sheet because you can use this data later on when you're analyzing stuff, also just to make sure you're collecting data ethically. Now there's this thing called the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board. And sometimes you have to get your survey approved through the IRB before you can actually administer it, depending on the contents. So this is for protection of human subjects' rights and whatnot. So if you don't have IRB approval, you don't get a survey. Also, it would be nice to include a section on demographics so that information can help you draw conclusions in the data later. Additionally, the subjects of your study need informed consent of what exactly they're doing and what their answers will be used for. On the slide, you'll see a link to a bunch of questions and kind of a survey to see if your survey will have to go through the IRB, just to see. All right, that's it. Hope y'all have a good day. Bye.